Welcome to the Scientific Worldview, the podcast dedicated to exploring the big questions in science and philosophy. I am Daniel Gambacorta.
I am Atana Shannon.
Atana, in our last episode, we discussed political psychology. We tried to answer the question, why do people vote? And the theory we considered was people vote to impact the outcome of the election. The main point of that is to affect which policies get implemented and which laws get passed. This is a pretty intuitive theory, would you not agree?
Yeah, I agree.
And there's something to it, but turns out this theory doesn't do a great job explaining why people vote. It doesn't seem like it's the main reason why most people vote is to affect which policies are implemented. This is because, as discussed in our previous episode, voters have a very low chance of affecting the outcome of an election. Very, very, very low. People seem to have some awareness that their chances of affecting who gets elected are not high. It doesn't seem like people are thinking in terms of expected value, which could justify a vote nonetheless. People generally don't vote their self-interest. Doesn't seem like they're voting altruistically either, because you'd expect them to actually know more about what's going on. People's policy preferences are somewhat incoherent. People vote based on superficial characteristics like height and voice pitch, and people are generally quite ignorant about politics and policy. So when we put all these facts together, it makes it seem like affecting policy is perhaps not the main reason why most people vote, even if it is a reason why many people vote. So if people aren't mainly voting to affect policy, why are they voting?
Are they voting to be part of an in-group?
Yeah, I think that could be part of it.
Like, oh, I'm a registered Democrat. I'm going to vote for the Democratic candidate.
Yeah, that's part of a theory that I think we should delve into. But let's even broaden this a bit. We focused on voting, but why does your typical person engage with politics at all? Like, why go to a protest? If it's a protest with, let's say, 1,000 people, whether or not you are there, not going to make a huge difference. Likewise, people enjoy arguing politics on social media. Would you agree with that?
I do agree. I'm thinking like virtue signaling.
Sure, I think that's going to be part of our theory. But let's just collect some more observations. So people, they like to argue about politics, especially on social media. And if we think about why they're doing that, is it to influence policy? Are they getting into these arguments in order to affect what laws are passed? Now, obviously, the vast majority of people who are tweeting about politics, they're not having any influence on policy. Nor are they really trying to. I don't think people are optimizing for making the best arguments to the most important people so that you could have some effect on what policies get implemented. People they just like to argue. They seem to just like to argue for their position with whoever.
Yeah, that I will agree with that too.
All right, so we have all this political behavior. People are spending time on it. They're motivated to do it. Most of this is having basically zero effect on anything.
Right.
So what's going on? So you mentioned an in-group / virtue signaling theory. I think that's a useful theory. Let's get to that. I'll talk about another theory first and then get to that one.
Okay.
First theory. We have a political instinct and we like to exercise it. An analogy would be pornography. At first blush, pornography might be puzzling from an evolutionary perspective. The evolutionary function of sexuality is reproduction. Pornography is creating arousal without the potential for reproduction. So it would seem like this is some kind of maladaptive misfiring. What's going on is pornography is giving someone cues that they are involved in a sexual encounter. And those cues, in the form of, say, images or video, are close enough to the real thing that they're still triggering the same response that a real sexual encounter would. So it's this simulation of a sexual encounter that's stimulating the brain in a similar way to a real sexual encounter. And since people like sex, they like pornography because it's close enough to the real thing. It's creating similar sorts of experiences. In the ancestral environment, these sorts of experiences would only have been caused by a real sexual encounter, but in this modern age, we're able to create a simulation which can have similar enough effects that people like it.
Right. I think
That
that
makes
makes
sense?
sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
So turning back to politics, we humans spent most of our evolution living in tribes of 20 to 150 people. And there would be political disputes like, what do we do with someone who's injured and can no longer be productive? Or how will meat from large game be distributed? And the outcome of these political disputes could have a big effect on your life and the life of your family. These group sizes are so small, one individual could be very influential. So being able to convince other people of your political beliefs could have enhanced your fitness and thus been the kind of thing that was selected for. So we could be selected for arguing for our political positions. It is the kind of thing that in the ancestral environment would have enhanced fitness. So we evolve these political instincts. We want to convince others of our political positions. We feel motivated to do it. And we feel this motivation in spite of the fact that in our modern huge world, one person's vote is extremely unlikely to change anything. So this is basically a mismatch theory. There's a mismatch between the ancestral environment we evolved in which political talk could have some real influence on what happens, and our modern environment in which your political talk has basically no influence on anything. So tweeting about politics is a sort of pornography. It's stimulating your political instinct, even though it's not having the kind of fitness enhancing effect it would have had in the ancestral environment.
Oh, that's actually really interesting. I like that. I've heard similar theories about anxiety, so I think that makes sense.
I think there's plausibly something to that theory. Now let's move on to theory that you proposed. I'll generalize it a bit. It's a theory that people engage in political behavior as a form of signaling. It's a way to signal your values, signal your group affiliations. Voting and protesting and tweeting, these are ways of showing off the kind of person you are and what tribe you are a part of. That's kind of what you were gesturing at, right?
Right.
All right, well, let's look at the data. Consistent with your theory, people quite openly discriminate against others based on their political beliefs. Looking at data from 2016, around 50% of people say they would have trouble being friends with somebody who voted for the candidate that they opposed, which in this case, we're talking about presidential candidate. It was Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. More than 50% of people said they would not entertain the idea of dating someone who voted for the candidate that they oppose. Around 40% of people say they would be upset if their child married someone from the opposing political party. So your political behavior is rather socially important. People
Yeah.
vote. Yeah, people vote and they tweet. And it's a way to show off the kind of person you are, and it allows people to sort with others who are similar.
I think it also allows like your ideas to be validated by others because you're existing in this sort of echo chamber and feeds the ego a little bit,
Yeah, that's a good point. Put
in
ideas
addition to
out
other
there
things.
that are important to you People agree with them. They tell you you're right. An ultimate explanation for that kind of motivation might be like theory one. Like, why are we doing this in the first place? We're select two because it would have enhanced fitness. And then on a proximal level, you might say it feels good when somebody is like, hey, you're right about that political thing.
Yeah,
And that's what like
exactly.
motivates you to do it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Your political beliefs can also directly affect life outcomes. There was a study in which participants had to evaluate resumes of high school students and decide who to award a scholarship to. These resumes varied by grades, but there's also indicators of political affiliation. A resume might say something like, this person was the president of the Young Republicans Club. So just something that would give away what their politics are. 80% of participants, people who are doing the ratings, chose to award the scholarship to a member of their favored political party, even when another applicant had better grades. So they are being biased by the politics of the candidate.
Yeah, obviously. I think too, when you're considering giving someone a scholarship, you're considering like what impact you want that person to make.
It's a good point.
So it makes sense to be biased towards your
Yeah.
own like position.
I want a fellow teammate to get this scholarship because then they'll go on to help my team.
Precisely.
25% of sociology professors admit they would favor a Democrat over a Republican for a job in their department. Now, you might
Yeah.
think that professors should be evaluated based on their research and teaching, and not something completely irrelevant like who they voted for. Especially given universities are heavily subsidized by the government, professors should be hired based on their ability to serve the public good. Alas, many sociology professors openly admit they would discriminate against candidates based on their political affiliation. Just more generally, it's certainly the case that some employers will discriminate against job candidates based on their political views, even if those political views are not directly related to their ability to do the job.
I think that also a lot of sociology professors know why they're Democrats.
Explain that cryptic statement.
I
They
mean,
know why they're Democrats. They know why.
in the best way. And why they would be looking for it makes sense why they would be biased. Every experience with a sociology professor that I've had has had such a liberal stance
Mm-hmm.
that I think it shines through, especially in their teaching.
I agree.
That was that was what I was getting at with my crypticism.
Yeah, most professors are liberal, but if you look at sociology, it's like, I don't know, 90% at least.
Most professors in general.
Yeah, most professors
Okay.
in general are liberal. When you start looking at like psychology, it's like very liberal. And then like sociology, it's like extra very liberal.
I like these measurements. I'm going to start using those.
So suffice it to say, your political behavior is an important signal and it affects your life in very real ways. And this is one reason why we see so much conformity in politics. People will often just go with the views of the tribe that they're affiliated with because they want to remain a tribe member in good standing. Next, let's tackle a question of political science. If voters are mostly pretty ignorant and their political behavior is largely driven by signaling, how could democracy work? Shouldn't we end up with bad policies?
Yeah, probably. I think we do. I don't know if it works like perfectly.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll tell you what, Atana. Political scientists have a response to this question.
What is it?
It is known as the miracle of aggregation. It goes a little something like this. If voter errors, like the mistakes that they make because they're ignorant,
Right.
if voter errors are purely random, then the random errors should cancel out, and even a small proportion of well-informed voters should suffice for democracy to function well. Here's an example. Imagine we have a direct democracy made up of 10 people. They're voting on whether to enact some policy. And this policy is a good policy. It will make everyone better off. In this democracy, 8 of the 10 people are totally ignorant. And because they're ignorant, they're basically going to vote at random. Half of them will vote in favor of the policy, half will vote against the policy. So, 4 of them will vote in favor, 4 will vote against. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So, we are left with 2 voters who are well informed. And because they're well informed, they will vote in favor of the policy because it's a good policy.
Okay.
So, in this model, half of the ignorant voters will vote in favor, half will vote against, and those random votes will just cancel each other out. The 4 who voted in favor will cancel out the 4 who voted against. The remaining 2 votes from well-informed voters will therefore decide whether the policy gets enacted. So in this model, the policy will be enacted because the well-informed votes will be decisive.
Okay. That makes sense.
So according to this model, democracy will still work extremely well, even if the vast majority of people are ignorant. They can have no idea what's going on. Democracy will still work well as long as you have some portion of the population that is well informed.
Yeah. So even if you're ignorant, your vote still matters.
If you're ignorant, you'll vote randomly, and that'll be canceled out by some other ignorant person voting randomly.
Okay.
And
That's
then
your safety net.
And then the election will actually be decided by the few people who are paying attention. That's
Good
the
to
idea.
know.
Okay.
This is a group grade. We're going to pass no matter what.
Exactly. But a ton of miracles don't exist, do they?
I mean,
They don't.
okay, sure. Okay, so.
And this particular miracle of quote unquote aggregation fails because the model is wrong. It doesn't make sense to model votes as random. People suffer from systematic biases when it comes to voting. If most people are going to be biased in a particular direction, we can't just assume that their vote is random. I'll give you some examples.
Yeah. Give me some examples.
All right. Most people suffer from a pessimism bias. They think the world is worse than it really is, and they think that things are getting worse in general. There are surveys where people are asked about whether various indicators of human welfare have been getting better or worse over time, like poverty, income, women's education, child vaccination, deaths from natural disasters, lifespan. And people do pretty terrible on these sorts of tests. People are way too pessimistic. Over the past 200 years, the percent of people in the world living in extreme poverty has gone down from 94% to 10%. Child mortality has gone down from 43% to 4%. Literacy has gone up from 12% to 85%. People getting a basic education has gone up from 17% to 86%. So people have a tendency to think things have gotten worse when in general things have gotten much better. So we have a systematic bias.
Ah, that's going to be my reason for living today. Thank you,
Okay,
Daniel.
good. And this biased information leads to nonsensical policy preferences. For example, you ask Americans, how does the United States spend their money?
Poorly.
How's the budget organized? Americans think 25% of the US budget goes to foreign aid, just sending money to other countries to help them. Now, the actual amount is less than 1%. So this isn't like a random error where, well, half the country's overestimating, half the country's underestimating. There's an extremely strong tendency to overestimate. Now, Americans will say they think it would be reasonable to dedicate 10% of the budget to foreign aid. So Americans think they want less foreign aid, but they actually want more because they're overestimating the amount we spend on foreign aid so much. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So because we have these systematic errors, people end up with policy preferences that are totally nonsensical. This is all to say that the miracle of aggregation is no miracle. I think you are right, Atana. We have bad policies.
We have some pretty. What's our military budget?
A lot. It's a lot.
There's one of our problems, I think.
We have a bunch of policies that actually make the vast majority of people worse off.
Yeah.
But they stick around in part because voters are ignorant and they suffer from these systematic biases.
Yep, that makes sense. Because we don't actually know what we're like putting our budget into.
Yeah, people are generally ignorant about how politics works, which we talked about in the last episode.
Right. Is that public information anywhere? Like, can we fact check ourselves?
About how ignorant people are?
No, but about what the budget goes to.
Yeah, that's public information.
Interesting. Asking for a friend.
Okay. Well, this leads us to an even more grand question in political science, which is, which form of government is best?
Good one.
Yes, I'm on board with that. Let's have good government.
Good government 2024.
Yeah. Let's reduce bad government.
Yep. Boo, bad government.
Replace it with good government. So there's a lot of different factors to consider when thinking about this question. For now, I just want to focus on comparing democracy with autocracy. The United States is an example of a democratic government. We have a representative democracy where we elect people to represent our interests. There are aspects of the government that are not so democratic, but there's clearly a strong democratic element. Other democracies would include Canada, Mexico, Western Europe, Australia, Japan, India, South Africa, and a bunch of other places. Autocracy refers to absolute monarchies, dictatorships, and governments that hold elections, but the elections are basically fake, so it's really a dictatorship pretending to be something else. The words autocracy and authoritarian are somewhat interchangeable, so I'm going to use both. The authoritarian government lacks checks and balances. A single person or small group of people have a tremendous amount of power. The people's political freedoms are pretty limited. Some examples of authoritarian governments that exist today would be North Korea, China, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. So
there are multiple.
Oh, indeed. There are multiple.
I did not know that.
Which is better, democracy or autocracy?
No, I'm a little biased. I think democracy, but like not also not the way that we're doing it. I don't know.
Okay. So you're leaning towards democracy.
Yeah.
Maybe I could convince you to serve a king. Let's see.
We'll see.
So we've already discussed one big issue with democracy, and that's voters tend to be ignorant. They vote for bad policies. You end up with policies that make the vast majority of people worse off.
Right.
Another issue with representative democracy is the incentive structure that politicians operate under. Politicians want to get elected. They want to stay in office. Elections happen every couple years. So politicians are going to be incentivized to enact policies which make people feel better off in the short term. For example, United States, a president serves 4 years after being elected. A first-term president is going to try to enact policies that make them more likely to get reelected, which means making people happy over the course of a few years. The president is not incentivized to do what's best for the country in the long term. They're incentivized to do what's most appealing to voters in the short term. Because if you appeal to voters in the short term, you get reelected. If there's a policy that makes people happy now, but makes everyone worse off in 10 years, well, by that time, you're not going to be president anymore. So you don't have to deal with it. So our elected officials are optimizing for the short term in ways that might make us worse off in the long term.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense.
Do you want an example?
Of course.
Here's an example. Obvious example would be entitlements like Social Security and Medicare. Everyone who's looked at the numbers agrees that in the next decade or so, we are going to face a devastating financial crisis because maintaining these programs will be incredibly expensive due to our aging population, which is living longer, and healthcare costs are increasing. But no politician wants to stick their neck out and say that these programs need to be limited in some way because these programs are extremely popular. And likewise, no politician is advocating for a gigantic increase in taxes in order to fund these programs because that would be extremely unpopular. So we are in a situation where everyone knows we are heading for a cliff, but politicians can't do anything about it because the first politician who does something about it has no chance of being reelected.
Yeah. So what are we paying towards right now?
Social Security and Medicare. It's not going to go to like future you.
Yep. That's okay.
Yeah, who knows what those programs will look like in 40 years? I have no idea.
I don't know if they'll be around.
Yeah, maybe we'll reach the singularity. Money will no longer be a thing. We'll be uploaded to the
Be
cloud.
ideal.
Yeah, we'll just live in virtual reality.
I'm gonna have the coolest pixels.
Yet another issue with democracy is polarization and gridlock. In a democracy, there are these different groups who want different things. In order to get anything done, these groups have to strike compromises, which is really hard. So you end up in a situation where it's hard to do anything because you need to get a lot of people to agree, which is difficult. In the United States, for example, unless we're in a situation where the same party controls the presidency and the House of Representatives and the Senate, it's pretty hard to do anything. If the Republicans and Democrats want different things, nothing's getting done. It's very hard. It's very hard to do anything.
I think that's been pretty visible time and time again, yeah.
And this goes beyond the mere difficulty of finding a compromise that both sides find appealing. Politicians know that voters are typically pretty ignorant as to what's going on. The heuristic that voters overutilize is to blame the president for everything. The president gets too much credit for good things and too much credit for bad things. Whichever party doesn't control the presidency, therefore, has an incentive to prevent anything from getting done or even promoting bad outcomes in hopes that the dysfunction will be blamed on the president, who could then hopefully be replaced by a fellow party member in the next election cycle. So basically, there can be an incentive to induce dysfunction when you know the other party is going to get the blame for it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right. Is a king starting to sound pretty good?
I don't know.
You're not
I don't
sold.
know. What about a king? I'm just not confident in any government.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you could be an anarcho-capitalist.
I just gotta live feral in the woods for a while.
Okay, yeah, and you can do that too.
I'll be my own king.
I mean, nobody's stopping you really. If you want to go live in the woods,
Yeah, that's true.
Nobody's gonna like force you to not do that.
I'm gonna make like a stick shelter and live with the seasons.
Yeah.
Yep.
Talk to the birds.
Talk to the birds.
So those are some bad things about democracy. Let's talk some good things.
All right, let's talk about it.
Democracies have a peaceful transfer of power. There's a formal mechanism for deciding who becomes a leader and how long they get to be a leader for. If you have an election, it's perceived to be fair, then people are generally accepting of the result, even if they didn't get what they want. An elected leader is seen as legitimate because they were chosen by the people. This system can be superior to a dictatorship, in which after a dictator dies, there's a power vacuum, which leads to mass chaos and violence as people fight over who has power.
Right. Except sometimes there is a little bit of tension.
Even in a democracy?
Even in a democracy.
There can be if people do not perceive the election to be legitimate.
That's true.
And if you're thinking of recent U.S. history, in which an election was perceived by some to not be legitimate, and that led to a chaotic environment. I'm trying to be as neutral as possible as I talk about recent events, not taking any sides here.
Yes.
Okay. Democracies have a good track record. Democracies do not face mass starvation. Democratic governments do not kill their own citizens in large numbers. Democracies tend to be wealthier than authoritarian states. People in democracies report higher levels of happiness. And we see people moving from authoritarian states to democracies rather than the other way around, which probably indicates they think their life will be better in a democracy.
Yeah, that makes sense, because why would you move from somewhere where your life wouldn't be better?
In general, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk autocracy. One advantage of autocracy is they can respond quickly to events. The government is driven by one person or a very small group of people who have absolute power. They can make things happen. Autocracies can get things done quickly.
Because all the government is just that one.
Yeah, the king decides the thing happens, it happens. Right? There's no process that can face gridlock.
Right.
Some argue that dictators are better leaders because they are incentivized to care about the future. They don't have to worry about an election cycle, so they can act for the benefit of their country in the long term. And though this seems like it's plausible in theory, it often doesn't play out that way in practice. So whereas a democratically elected leader is incentivized to make their constituents happy because they want to be reelected, a dictator has no such incentive. So a dictator can be pretty terrible, and there's no formal mechanism for getting rid of them. Dictators do have to worry about being assassinated or deposed, but that doesn't necessarily motivate them to do what's best for their people. A dictator may conclude that their best chance of staying in power results from their people being poor and misinformed. Indeed, this is what's going on in North Korea. The dictator of North Korea is Kim Jong-un. The people of North Korea are much poorer than the people of South Korea. And Kim Jong-un is fabulously wealthy, of course. But the people of North Korea are told by the government that they actually are wealthier than South Koreans. They're taught that Kim Jong-un is borderline divine. They're not allowed to access media from outside the country that might contradict something the government says. They're not allowed to criticize the government. They're not allowed to leave the country. So dictators can maintain power by making people worse off, and there's no formal way to get rid of them.
Right. It seems like they could care more about the long term, but they choose not to.
They don't necessarily have a strong incentive to. I guess you could say you are going to be the leader for a long time, and you care about the future of the country because your kids are going to live in it after you die. but that doesn't seem to be a super strong incentive for dictators to like improve the welfare of their people. Just in practice, it doesn't seem to work out super well.
Right.
There's much more that could be said about forms of government, but let's just leave it at that. So, you've heard the arguments. Are you team democracy or team autocracy?
I'm a democratic girly today.
We took a little detour into political science. Let's swerve back into psychology. Let's talk about swerve. Let's talk about causes and correlates of political ideology. There are behavioral genetics studies investigating the role of genes and environment on ideology. I've discussed behavioral genetics in previous episodes, so I won't rehash the whole thing. But the simplest methodology is to compare identical twins who are separated at birth. Identical twins have all the same genes. If they're separated at birth, they have completely different environments. So we can see if these identical twins, separated at birth, nonetheless have a similar political ideology. If they do, that similarity must be due to genes. Can't be due to the environment because they have a completely different environment. And there's other methodologies behavioral geneticists use. For more information, check out the episode titled, Is Homosexuality Genetic? These sorts of studies have found that the political party that people identify with is mostly due to the shared environment. This is aspects of the environment that siblings share, like parents, the home, the neighborhood. So if you grew up in a conservative household, you're more likely to be conservative even if you aren't genetically related to the people who are raising you. And I think most people would find this to be intuitive.
Yeah, that makes sense.
All that being said, when you ask people about particular political issues, the role of the shared environment is much smaller and the role of genes is larger. So if you ask people about the economy or immigration or attitudes about sex, genes account for a big chunk of the variance in views. The variance accounted for by genes varies depending on the question you ask, but it's in the ballpark of 40%. The variance accounted for by the shared environment is in the ballpark of 10%, and the rest of the variance is accounted for by the non-shared environment, which is aspects of the environment that siblings don't share. So again, headline finding, 40% of the variation in political views on issues is due to genetics. And I think that would surprise a lot of people.
Yeah, that's pretty high. I wouldn't have ever considered genetics to be one of the contributing factors.
Perhaps it's less surprising if we think about factors that relate to people's political views. For example, sex is determined by genes, and sex correlates with political views. Personality is strongly influenced by genes and correlates with political views. Moral judgments, and indeed the moral foundations that we discussed previously, also have a genetic basis. And obviously, how people think about morality is going to relate to their political views. So you could think of it like this: we're all exposed to a variety of political views. We will find some of them appealing and some of them not so appealing. One factor that determines whether we find a political view appealing is our genes, because genes affect brain development, and your brain is the part of you that's forming political opinions.
Yeah, I guess when you take those factors into consideration, it all adds up.
The strongest personality predictor of ideology is openness to experience. Highly open people tend to be liberal. Liberals are also higher in neuroticism, and conservatives are a bit higher in conscientiousness.
I think when you think about tradition, too, which is one of the core values of a lot of conservative viewpoints. Like tradition is almost the opposite of openness to experience in a way.
Yeah, I see what you're getting at.
Yeah.
Compared to conservatives, liberals have more mental illness. They are less physically attractive,
Oh,
less happy, and they have shorter lifespans.
that was a complete roast. Thank you.
I am just reviewing the data.
Okay. Well, scientific roast today.
We previously talked about how artists tend to be liberal. Liberals just care more about art.
Yeah.
Similarly, liberals just tend to care more about politics.
Hmm. Okay.
Liberals are much more likely to donate to a political campaign. And this doesn't have to do with liberals being wealthier. As we've discussed before, the correlation between ideology and wealth is quite weak. Liberals are more likely to go to a protest. Liberals are less tolerant of political disagreement. Liberals are more likely to say they have blocked someone on social media due to their political views. In a study, liberals and conservatives were asked, would you be upset if your child married someone with political views which opposed yours? In other words, if you're liberal, would you be upset if your child married a conservative? Or if you're conservative, would you be upset if your child married a liberal? Liberals are more likely to be upset about their child marrying someone with different political views.
I think given all of the personality traits that were more common, it also makes sense that that would be the behavior predicted.
Liberals and conservatives have been asked, would you be comfortable being roommates with somebody who disagrees with you politically? Liberals are more likely to say they would not be comfortable with that. Liberals and conservatives are asked, would you date someone of the opposing political ideology? Liberals are more likely to say they absolutely will not date someone who disagrees with them politically.
Wow.
So liberals just care more. They care more about politics.
Yeah, it makes sense. Seems like it.
All right, we've discussed morality, we've discussed politics. Next, I want to talk about a topic related to morality and politics. Let's talk about the sacred.
The sacred?
Sacredness.
Okay. Let's talk about it.
People perceive some things to be sacred. Sacred things are somehow elevated, they're pure, they have to be protected from being degraded. We already talked about the sacred in our discussion of moral foundations. One of the moral foundations is sanctity, beliefs about the sacredness of life and exactly what counts as sacred underlie some people's view of abortion. Some people who are against gay marriage claim that marriage is a sacred institution. It is degraded if gay people are allowed to get married. So people's perceptions of the sacred are intertwined with their morality.
National parks are sacred.
Are they?
I think I think that's a good example.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It's a
And
non-problematic one.
that would motivate people wanting to preserve these national parks.
Right. They're like sacred in the eyes of the law.
Yeah. Mixing the sacred with the profane can cause revulsion and moral outrage. For example, Atana, how much money is a life worth?
I don't know. Uh it is without price.
Exactly. It's incalculable.
Thank you. That's the word I was
How
looking
could
for.
you compare a human life with money?
Doesn't it like actually have a worth though?
Well, that sort of calculation does have to be conducted in places that have like a socialized healthcare system.
Right.
Some government committee has to decide how much a year of healthy life is worth and then use that to decide whether or not to fund life-saving treatments. And there will be people whose lives could be saved, but The treatment required is so expensive, the government deemed their life not worth saving because the money could be more effectively spent in other ways.
Boo.
Right, that kind of thing upsets people, right?
Yeah.
Mixing together something sacred like life, something profane like money, causes outrage, causes revulsion. It's
Yeah.
uncomfortable.
How dare you?
How dare you? Similarly, some people are opposed to surrogacy. They see birth and the relationship between the mother and the child as this sacred thing, and it's disgusting to mix that with commerce.
Oh, they're upset about the money that's in there.
Yeah, I think that's part of it.
Okay.
Along similar lines, some people see sex as sacred. They're offended by prostitution. You're mixing sex with money.
Yeah. I think I understand that.
The emotion most associated with the sacred is awe, AWE.
Oh.
Awe is caused by the presence of something vast that transcends your current understanding. Awe is associated with feeling small, feeling like your personal concerns are insignificant, a realization that the day to day stuff you worry about isn't really important. There's something far more grand at play. When people experience awe, they become less selfish. They're more willing to be generous, to cooperate, and to engage in self sacrifice. Here's a personal account of awe by the early feminist Margaret Fuller. Quote, I saw that there was no self, that selfishness was all folly and the result of circumstance. It was only because I thought self real that I suffered, that I had only to live in the idea of the all, and all was mine. Unquote.
It sounds like a party. I want to join
An awe party.
an awe party. Have you ever experienced awe?
Oh, we'll get to that.
Okay.
One theory of awe is it functions to bind people together. It makes a group of people more cooperative, more willing to be altruistic towards each other, which benefits everyone in the group. And indeed, societies evolve rituals for bringing people into the realm of the sacred. Cultures develop practices that facilitate collective experiences of awe, which motivate people to care less about their selfish desires and more about the group as a whole. These practices often involve synchrony, doing the same things at the same time, like singing, chanting, marching, dancing. To enable people to have shared experiences of the sacred, cultures will identify particular periods of time as sacred, like the Sabbath or holy days. Cultures will identify particular locations as sacred, like shrines, churches, and temples. And cultures will identify sacred objects like the Bible or the Quran.
Right.
All right, next, let's talk about the most common elicitors of awe. What makes people feel awe? The number one most common elicitor of awe is witnessing courage, strength, and or kindness. You see somebody overcome something really difficult. You see someone sacrifice themselves for the greater good. You witness moral beauty. Have you ever had this sort of experience?
Probably. I can't think of a specific
Okay.
example, but can have you?
Yes. So, a feature of witnessing moral beauty is it makes you want to do good. Have you ever experienced that?
Yeah.
Like somebody does good things, you're like, oh, I want to be good too.
Yeah.
So I watched a talk given by the philosopher Toby Ord, in which he discussed his plans to give away most of his wealth to charity for the rest of his life. And
Mm.
that definitely had a big effect on me, and it motivated me to want to give to charity.
Ooh, very cool.
This elicitor of awe helps us understand some of the pleasure that people get from consuming fiction. When you're reading a book or watching a movie, you're experiencing this simulation of reality. You're empathizing with the characters, especially the protagonist. A very common trope in fiction is the protagonist is overcoming something. You get to watch someone do something that requires a lot of courage. Like maybe they're fighting a villain who's much more powerful than they are. The protagonist is typically a good person who does good things. You watch the protagonist engage in these acts of moral beauty, and watching these characters be strong and brave and good can make us feel awe in a similar way that we would if we were to witness these sorts of things in real life.
Right. I'm a fiction consumer.
Have you had awe experiences with fiction that you can like identify?
Uh, Nothing specific that I can identify,
Okay.
but I do feel like I grew up in the generation when all of the dystopian books were
Mm-hmm.
being written
Yeah.
about like standing up to authority. And I
Yeah,
think that definitely gave me some issues.
yeah. Okay. I think the solicitor of awe is also important for understanding religion. For example, the central story of Christianity is about a guy named Jesus who's willing to be killed painfully in order to atone for the sins of humanity. And the story is meant to be interpreted as an act of moral beauty that Jesus sacrificed himself for you because he loves you.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the
You know the story.
legends.
You've heard of that guy?
I've heard of that guy.
Okay. A second elicitor of awe is known as collective effervescence. This occurs when a group of people have some shared emotional experience. People feel as if they have merged into the larger group. They have a sense of unity, they have a sense of belonging. Collective effervescence can occur during religious ceremonies, sporting events, concerts, political rallies, weddings, graduations. Have you ever had an experience like this?
Watching fireworks.
Okay, so you were in like a big group?
Yeah, like at
Okay,
a baseball stadium
okay. It's a good example.
or the balloon fiesta.
Okay, yeah, that's a good example. So in these cases, there's a strong aesthetic element to it.
Yeah, you're all feeling like joy and happiness.
Yeah. I think the closest thing I've ever had to collective effervescence was playing kickball at an evolutionary psychology conference.
That sounds fun.
I kicked the winning run, my greatest athletic achievement.
Very cool.
A third elicitor of awe is nature, especially cataclysmic events like earthquakes, wildfires, tsunamis. Night skies are also a common element. Have you had awe experiences in nature?
Yeah, like especially with the stars and stuff, that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense. When I used to live in the mountains, I would sit outside and just like count the stars, count shooting stars for a long time. That was like a lot of just calming, awesome
Mm-hmm. A
experience.
few months ago, you mentioned a bee landing near your window, and it
Oh
was
yeah,
kind
that
of like
was
a
cool.
spiritual experience of sorts.
Yeah, there was a bee, like it was like January, like way too early for bees. And it landed on my uh windshield and just like stayed there. It
Mm-hmm.
was so weird. I
But
have a
you
video
you
of it.
kind of like you interpreted it in a sort of deeper way, right?
I think, yeah, I was like, what is the bee trying to say to me? Because bees
Yeah.
shouldn't be around in January.
Okay.
And then I have a bee tattoo.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like meaningful.
Yeah. Experiences of awe associated with nature are probably linked to the ways that people moralize nature. Earlier, you talked about wanting to preserve national parks. That's the kind of thing I'm gesturing
Yeah.
at here. Some people see nature as sacred. They see nature as inherently valuable. It's important. above and beyond its effects on conscious creatures. And some of these people are offended by humanity's effect on nature. They think humanity is degrading the sacredness of nature.
Don't litter in our parks.
A fourth elicitor of awe is music. Have you had awe experiences listening to music?
Yeah, like at good concerts.
Mm-hmm.
Those are always awesome experiences.
Okay. What's a recent good
Or,
concert?
oh, I went to Foo Fighters. That was a good concert.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm excited. I'm going to go see Noah Khan this summer. And I'm going to see Cage the Elephant next month.
Oh, okay. Was that Foo
And
Fighters concert the best, the best, the best, the best?
it was pretty good,
Okay.
honestly. They were pretty good.
I was making a Foo Fighters joke there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Never did in the best, the best, the best, the best
Okay,
of
see, when you
you.
sing it, I get
Okay.
it. When you sing it, I get it. I'm
Okay.
sorry.
I don't know if I'd use the
Obviously,
word sing to describe what I just did, but yeah.
it was akin to singing.
Yeah. If someone perceives music to be sacred, then if it's mixed with something profane like money or fame, that could be off-putting. For example, a musician writes a song, they think it's a great song, but then a producer tells them they have to change something about the song so it'll be more popular. The musician might bristle and feel like their art is being degraded. It's degrading to change a work of art in order to please more people.
Yes.
A fifth elicitor of awe is visual design. Arts. You're an artist of sorts. Do you have experiences of awe involving arts?
Yeah, I guess so. Like sometimes when I make something and I'm like, wow, I actually done did that. Cool beans.
So you are in awe of yourself.
Yeah. Or like the color.
Okay.
Usually I'm really super into Viridian green right
Okay.
now.
Okay.
And it inspires awe in me.
Okay.
It's
I
such a
mean,
pretty color.
I'm definitely familiar with green.
You gotta specifically Viridian green.
Okay. That sounds like a town in Pokemon or something.
I don't know how to explain it except for like a very blue base
Okay.
to a dark green.
So video games are a combination of visual design and music and gameplay and story. Have you ever played Octopath Traveler?
No,
That game gave me faith in humanity.
really? That's so sweet.
And if you ask me what that means, I don't know. It was just a feeling. I
That's
played it
valid.
and I was like, I have faith in humanity now.
What's it called? Octopath?
Octopath Traveler, it's like an old school RPG, but it's
Yeah.
like a modern version.
Oh,
A sixth elicitor of awe is spirituality slash religion. You feel the presence of God. You experience a moment of satori after years of meditation. You become enlightened. Have you had any spiritual experiences?
I think so. Nothing that has put me in awe.
Okay. Psychedelic drugs can give people a feeling, which is often tied to spirituality. There's a very strange phenomenon where people will take some hallucinogen, they'll have an experience of awe, and then they will interpret it as evidence for the existence of God or the existence of something supernatural, which is a very strange thought process indeed. Here's an analogy. If you take a bunch of meth, you could have a psychotic episode. If you take a bunch of meth and you hear voices, it would be very strange to conclude that the meth allowed you to hear these voices, which are real. You agree?
Right.
So if you hear
Yes.
voices in your head after taking meth, you shouldn't take that as evidence that like spirits are communicating with you or aliens are contacting you or something like that. Rather, the meth is affecting your brain in such a way that it's causing the perception of voices. But There's no actual creature speaking to you.
Please don't take meth.
Also, don't take meth. This is coming from an Albuquerque resident, home of Breaking Bad.
Please avoid meth.
Avoid meth.
It is bad for you.
In the same way, you can take psychedelics and they will affect your brain in such a way as to make you feel awe and you feel connected with the universe and whatever. You shouldn't take that as evidence that there is a god or spirits or something. That's a bizarre conclusion to draw from taking a drug. A seventh elicitor of awe is epiphany. You learn something about science or math or philosophy, and it changes the way you understand the world. Have you ever had an epiphany?
In high school, I had to write a paper that was called an epiphany paper. We had to write about an epiphany we'd had by the age of 16.
Okay.
I don't remember what mine was, but someone's epiphany was that they never had an epiphany.
Okay. Okay.
They did not get a
Kind of
good
goes
grade.
against the spirit of the assignment, but
she she did not grade them well. Um,
any epiphanies since age 16?
I think probably, and I'm not sure if I can remember them, so
Okay.
maybe
Okay.
not. I feel like I would remember an epiphany,
Mm-hmm.
probably.
I've definitely had some epiphanies. I think reading The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins was an epiphany. I think studying evolutionary psychology was an epiphany. I have a vague memory of having an epiphany when studying the philosophy of Nick Bostrom, who I guess is most famous for talking about the simulation argument.
That we're living in a
Yeah.
simulation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Epiphany is perhaps a reason why some people see the truth as sacred, feeling disgusted and offended by falsehoods. And maybe at some point, you get fed up with the misinformation we're constantly bathed in. You decide to start a podcast dedicated to the truth. That might be the kind of thing that someone would do.
I don't know. That sounds like you're speaking a little bit from experience.
I don't know what you're talking about. But anyway, Atana, there are so many more truths to uncover, aren't there?
Always.
And we shall uncover said truths on the next episode of The Scientific Worldview.